Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the shows list at harbingermedianetwork.com. In the United States, right-wing attacks on transgender people continue, with hundreds of anti-trans bills proposed in legislatures. Parallel to this, there's an unending stream of blatant and more subtle anti-trans ideas in the media, including in liberal publications like the New York Times. These were ably skewered by a good recent episode of the podcast If Books Could Kill, called The New York Times War on Trans Kids. There were at least 38 trans people killed in the US in 2022, according to the Human Rights Campaign, most of whom were Black or Latinx. We mustn't forget that along with anti-trans legislation, we're seeing another kind of assault on bodily autonomy in the US, legislation at the state level against abortion. The situation in so-called Canada isn't nearly as dire, though that should be no cause for complacency. Trans people are assaulted and murdered here too, with Indigenous and Black trans people being disproportionately harmed, and the far right, which fortunately is a lot weaker here than in the US, has shifted its focus from anti-mask and anti-vax protests to targeting trans people, especially events with drag performers. There have been more such protests so far in 2023 than in all of 2021, and the number this year is expected to be more than last year. Disturbingly, the liberal political establishment in the US and Canada has taken no real action to counter the growing threat to trans people's existence, as Misha Falk put it in an article published in Midnight Sun last year, which I'll include in the show notes for this episode. In order to help fight the right's anti-trans agenda as effectively as possible, socialists and other leftists need to understand it. What are they trying to achieve? How are they organizing? How can we fight back more effectively? So I'm really glad to have two guests joining me on this episode. Could you introduce yourselves?
I guess I'll go ahead and jump in. Hi, David. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. My name is Eric Maroney. I'm joining the discussion today from Connecticut, where I teach community college English. I'm also a graduate student at the University of Connecticut. More importantly, though, I'm a proud union member. I'm also active with the Tempest Collective, which is a modest socialist project here in the US. You can read about us at tempestmag.org. Relevant to this conversation, I identify as a transgender man, and I've done some writing about the present anti-trans political reaction.
Yes, my name is Skyler. I use they, them pronouns, and I've been monitoring the far right in Canada, in particular since the occupation of Ottawa last year, the convoy occupation. And I've been involved in a lot of organizing against the far right, both locally and in Eastern Ontario. In particular, in recent months, as you've mentioned, they've turned towards anti-trans and anti-drag organizing. And I've been involved in organizing some of the successful defenses of drag events in recent months.
Thank you both. So before we get into the attacks, let's start by laying out the history of equality rights gains for trans people. Eric, can you start us off by talking a little bit about the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really useful place to start too, because in order to understand the present backlash, right, we have to consider what is it that the right is reacting to. And so I think in the US, queer people have experienced significant legislative and cultural gains in a relatively short period of time. So sort of thinking back as recently as 2004, same-sex marriage was illegal in 49 of the 50 US states. And it actually wasn't until 2015, just 8 years ago, that same-sex marriage was recognized and protected at the federal level at all. And this was the result of a Supreme Court decision known as Obergefell v. Hodges. But parallel to the marriage equality movement and sort of extending beyond it has also been this push for transgender rights and recognition. And This push has included things like a modest increase in access to gender-affirming care, kind of streamlining these more bureaucratic procedures for changing one's name and gender marker on government or municipal ID forms, as well as a sort of heightened cultural visibility. And I think that last part, that cultural visibility, is important too. For example, in 2014, Time Magazine, a popular American magazine, features transgender actress Laverne Cox on its cover. And it's what has become known as the transgender tipping point, which is sort of heralded as this point in US culture where we've reached a turning point in acceptance for transgender people. To sort of continue giving a little bit of context to bring us up to the present moment, 2016, we see President Obama lift a ban on transgender people serving in the military. This ban was an extension of a ban on gay, lesbian, and bisexual people who were serving openly in the military. And just a few years ago, 2021, we see the Biden-Harris administration, the present presidential administration, ruling that an X-gender market be permitted on passport documents. And if I could just want to say just a few more words about all this. I think that there are segments of the left that will dismiss these wins and advances as being kind of inconsequential for working class people or non-elite queer people, like meaning inconsequential to those who are not interested in marriage or who oppose the institution of marriage, or inconsequential to those who are anti-imperialist, as one should be. Right, like those who oppose the military. But I think that this position is an oversimplification. And I think that it misses some of the significant gains of the last several decades. So absolutely, yes, gender affirming care remains out of reach for many. Even when it's not priced out of reach or legislated out of reach, the infrastructure is just not there. So in parts of the country, people spend literally years waiting to be connected with clinics and adequate providers. But what's more, right, gender affirming care has not always been covered by health insurance, period, right? So of course, in the US, we have a privatized, predominantly employer-based health insurance system that has a limited public option, but not all of these plans cover gender affirming care. For those that do, this is a relatively recent change. Just anecdotally, I had my first gender affirming surgical procedure in 2009. I was 25 years old. I spent $14,000 out of pocket. I used a student loan to pay for it and spent the next 10 years paying it back. So I share all this to emphasize that even while these advances are limited and incomplete, they are very much relevant. And I'll wrap up in just a few minutes here, because I think that while we're thinking about the advances made by queer and trans people, we also want to be aware that at the same time these advances have been made, it's equally important to note that over the same period, really the last 20 years, that we've seen a real decline in living standards for many Americans, right? There's a period that's been punctuated by what folks describe as multiple and intersecting crises, one that has brought on, if not a permanent precarity itself, certainly a permanent threat of precarity. And we can go through some of the details as to what that looks like. But I'll pause there for now.
Thanks. Skyler, do you want to say something about the Canadian situation?
Yes. So I think in Canada, there are sort of a lot of parallels to the American situation in terms of growing acceptance and growing sort of legislative victories for the 2S LGBTQIA community. I think in general, we've been probably a few years ahead of our friends to the South in terms of things like legalizing same-sex marriage and other sort of landmark legislative victories in terms of 2S LGBTQIA rights. I also think that we're in a similar situation with the sort of growing acceptance. I know in particular among students and young people, there does seem to be a lot more acceptance of 2S LGBTQIA identities in schools, in classroom settings, in that sort of thing, than there was probably 20 years ago. So you have a lot more students these days who are feeling comfortable with coming out and that sort of thing. In terms of human rights legislation, there was Bill C-16, which was passed in 2017, that amended the Canadian Human Rights Act and added gender identity and expression to that. This bill people had been pushing for something like this for about 10 years or so. Often there would be a bill that would end up getting either hung up in a committee, or it would die when an election was called and start all over again. It's also, if you remember, it is the bill that got Jordan Peterson famous when he became first prominent for either misunderstanding or intentionally mischaracterizing this bill as an assault on his freedom of speech. And most provinces also added gender identity to the list of prohibited grounds for discrimination around the same time, kind of the 2010s, in their various human rights legislation. And on the topic of healthcare in Canada, we do have, a public healthcare system which does have some gender affirming care for it, but included. However, contrary to what your American listeners may think, our Canadian healthcare system does have a lot of gaps, both in terms of certain aspects of gender affirming care which aren't covered, as well as just other gaps in general for things like dental, vision, that sort of thing. So a lot of people do have to rely on private insurance, which is generally through work for certain procedures and certain aspects of healthcare. And of course, this is a big issue because a lot of trans and non-binary people face discrimination in the labor market, so they're probably less likely to have good health benefits through their employment.
Thanks. Yeah, and also just as a footnote to that, and of course, the public system in Canada means that the way it's organized is that access varies a lot regionally, even within a single province, right? So thank you both for laying that context out. Can we start, Eric, with you in talking about the organizations that are today leading the assault on transgender people in the United States and how the assault has evolved to the point where it's at now?
Okay, so thank you for that question. I think that we can think about the U.S. Anti-trans assault as coming in three overlapping forms. So first, we're experiencing these waves of reactionary state-level laws and policies that are targeted at restricting trans people's civic participation as well as access to care. These are laws that prohibit trans access from things like scholastic sports, from access to public facilities, that banned youth access to gender-affirming care, but are also seeking to limit adult access to that care as well. In 2002, which is the last year that we have full data for, there were over 300 anti-LGBT bills that were introduced at state legislators. Now, according to the Human Rights Campaign, which is like a liberal LGBT advocacy group here, only 29 of those bills passed, or 10% of them were signed into law. But at the same time, the laws that have passed have had a real chilling effect. And I know we don't have time to go into all of them, but I think that it would be useful to just highlight some. For folks who want to know more, I would encourage them to check out the work of Erin Reed, who's an independent journalist and activist doing really important work to track these bills. So what I wanted to talk about was Tennessee, the state of Tennessee, where last month 2 bills were signed into law that literally are making it impossible to live as a visible trans person in that state. The first law defines gender as immutable and biologically determined by one's genes, right? And we can leave aside for a moment that not even geneticists are on the same page about this. The second bill, building off that, makes it a crime, a misdemeanor for the first offense, a Class E felony for the second offense, to perform what is called adult cabaret, where that performance could possibly be viewed by a child. So importantly, included in the definition of adult cabaret is male to female impersonation. So it's a law that is intended to be a ban on drag, but it's not difficult to see how this legislation will impact trans and gender nonconforming people simply as they seek to move about in public space. So I was just reading that there is a temporary ban or a temporary injunction on this law going into effect, but nevertheless, just the breadth of it is absolutely chilling. So I think that the legislative wave we can think of as one arm of the anti-trans assault. The sort of second form that I see it coming from is very closely related to the first. And these are the sort of like right-wing populist political figures, right? They're part of the populist wing of the Republican Party, or what we might call like the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, like Donald Trump's wing. There are individuals like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, but also media pundits like Tucker Carlson, who really are amplifying this anti-trans rhetoric with the goal of ginning up a right-wing base, right? First for the midterm elections, but then again, looking forward to the 2014 presidential race. And of course, not to be outdone, former President Trump did release a re-election campaign video where he promised to pass a law in all 50 states, putting a stop to gender-affirming care. So these are the right-wing voices that tend to dominate the news cycle, and what they do is they provide cover to the groups and individuals who are pushing legislation. Mother Jones, the magazine Mother Jones, investigative reporter Madison Pauley recently got her hands on a trove of emails between state-level legislators and these very well-funded anti-trans activists, folks like the Legal Giant, the Alliance Defending Freedom, which also operates not only in the United States but elsewhere. But this is a group that has been intimately involved with overturning Roe, has also been intimately involved in pushing this wave of anti-trans legislation. But also organizations like the American College of Pediatrics, which is also a conservative anti-choice group. So what we're seeing really is a significant collaboration between these well-funded anti-trans activist groups and state-level legislators, such that the bills being introduced across the country are sharing both the same language, the same framing, and the same strategies in terms of getting them passed. The Alliance Defending Freedom is like a particularly frightening organization. It's a legal front. It's an organization that has an operating budget of like over $45 million annually. They're a group that receives funding from a variety of conservative foundations, groups like Morgan Stanley Global Impact Partners. They have ties to the Koch brothers philanthropy, as well as the American Legislative Council, or ALEC. And so like we can think about like the point that I'm trying to get at here is that like, yeah, there's seemingly this groundswell of like anti-trans reaction, but like I think we also have to realize that there's a real sort of astroturf flavor to a lot of it, right? Like a lot of it's really sort of manufactured. The third sort of form, and I would say the most dangerous, is the anti-trans assault that takes the form of street activists, right? And so these are the groups and individuals who are attempting to shut down the drag story hour events, who are protesting local school boards. And this is where you're seeing the hard right element come into play. And I'll just share another anecdote, right? So last month in Akron, Ohio, there was a protest, a gathering to protest a right-wing story hour event. And what you had were hundreds of Proud Boys members, people with White Lives Matters, placards and banners, protesters descending on a park, Wadsworth Memorial Park. And what they were doing is they were disrupting this charity event. So there was a drag story hour event. It was there as a charity event. It was raising money for the survivors of the mass shooting that took place at Club Q, which is an LGBTQ bar in Colorado Springs, where last year 5 people were murdered and 25 people were injured. If you can see the cell phone footage from this right-wing protest, where there are literally Nazis like waving swastika flags, chanting things like "pedophiles get the rope" and "Weimar conditions, Weimar solutions." Of course, a reference to the Nazi ascendancy over the Weimar Reform period in Germany. And I'll wrap up in a minute here, because like although I think that is the most sort of dangerous element, also important to recognize is that in the mix, we're also beginning to see these parents' rights advocates, right? These groups that have developed a kind of distrust for public schools, who are equally kind of vocal in their opposition to critical race theory. These are the folks who are concerned with the banning of books, are concerned with the kinds of pronouns that their children are using in school. But they've also sort of developed this successful rhetoric around a distrust of medicine, right, which has been connected to the anti-vax or the anti-mask protests that we saw during the COVID period. Where I live, interestingly, the anti-mask group has rebranded itself to become the anti-gender group. Like, so they've completely changed their name. Perhaps we can come back to this, but I actually attended on Transgender Day of Visibility. I attended a sort of a parents' rights protest to just kind of get a flavor of what was going on. And I'll leave it there for now. If it's relevant, we can pick it back up. But I'll leave it there for now.
I'm sure the flavor was horrible. So my next question then is, how have the mainstream U.S. Liberal LGBT rights groups and leaders of the Democratic Party responded to this threefold assault that you've been talking about, Eric?
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I think that the mainstream liberal LGBTQ rights groups are still predominantly relying on a legal strategy. So for instance, here in the US, while people like Chase Strangio, who is the spokesperson for the ACLU, have been really sharp rhetorically on this issue, the conclusion, right, is always to lean into this legal strategy. So neither the American Civil Liberties Union nor the Human Rights Campaign have called for local or national demonstrations. Instead, these are organizations that are directing supporters to donate money to legal campaigns that are aimed at either preventing or overturning the anti-trans legislation. And I think that, the legal strategies are important, like absolutely important. But I think that without a ground game, the effectiveness of a legal strategy is always going to be blunted. I think it's a little more difficult to comment about liberal politicians. What I mean by that is that it's probably a little bit harder to communicate kind of like a broad conclusion. The Democrats at the national level did pass a somewhat symbolic but also consequential bill recognizing same-sex marriage, right? So as I had explained earlier, the U.S. got same-sex marriage through a Supreme Court decision. It was the same process that we got access to abortion rights, which was then overturned by a later Supreme Court decision. So while the federal legislation that was passed is somewhat symbolic, it is also consequential in recognizing or codifying same-sex marriage. But importantly, as a caveat to conservatives, it does allow for religious exemption. At the state level, there are just some jurisdictions where Republican strongholds are preventing any kind of meaningful resistance from political leaders, not from ordinary people, right? Like ordinary people are going to the state houses, raising their voices and doing what they can to stand in opposition to these really heinous bills. But there is really limited meaningful resistance from Democratic political leaders who are in Republican strongholds. But there's this other sort of odd phenomenon that's happening where in liberal states, like where I live, there's this very symbolic legislation that's being passed that does very little to actually help ordinary people. So for instance, as I mentioned, I live in Connecticut, and Governor Lamont has signed what is referred to as a trans sanctuary law. You can't make this stuff up. But there are parts of the country where if you are found to be allowing your child access to gender affirming care, the Department of Children and Families can investigate and take your children away. So a sanctuary law essentially allows families to migrate, right, to a liberal state with no reciprocity, right? That there'll be no communication between, school systems or legal jurisdictions or whatever. But there's also no money to support people when they come. There's no care infrastructure for any kind of influx of queer youth that might be coming here. I think that while they're important, they also, without funding, kind of add to that lack of credibility, right? That the anti-trans forces already have. The lack of faith that anti-trans forces already have in the government, right? The distrust of schools, the distrust of the distrust of government. I'll just leave that there. I don't know if it makes any sense at all, but.
For sure. And I have one other question before we move to talk about things going on north of the border, and that's, what's your take on the extent to which the anti-trans legislation has popular support on the ground in the U.S.?
No, that's a great question. So I was in order to answer that question, I didn't know how to answer that question. So I was looking at a poll, and it was a PBS poll, and the poll was noting that a majority of Americans actually, they still oppose this legislation. That's 54%. oppose the legislation, including at legislation that's aimed at preventing youth access to gender affirming care. But unfortunately, that number is down 15 points from just a year ago, right? So just a year ago, we were looking at more like 70%. And so what this shows is that the right is winning the rhetorical battle here, right? And the consequences for that are very dangerous. So I think that speaks to the urgency of our side getting organized and figuring out how to build a broader coalition. So circling back to the conversation we've been having and circling back to some of your earlier questions about the response from the Democratic Party or the response from liberal officials, as well as the question of who can be relied on and who can't be relied on in order to blunt the attack on queer and trans people, as well as defend against the growth of the right generally. And I really want to emphasize this notion that liberal politicians are not coming to save us. Just as we're recording this episode, President Biden has now released new guidance concerning transgender athletes in schools. Biden's new policy guidance disallows outright bans on trans athletes, but it also opens the door to legitimizing the rights claims about trans athletes, specifically about trans women and girls. So while this policy disallows blanket bans, it does allow bans that would, quote, minimize harm. And critics of the policy have really rightly pointed out that it reads like a how-to, essentially providing a roadmap for the right on how to enact discriminatory bans without violating the legislation that protects transgender and gender variant people. And it's the criteria that's been offered for determining whether one's transgender status is can be the cause of potential harm to sex-segregated sports. It's so broad, right? So it includes things like gender markers on birth certificates, on driver's license, on passports, but also some of the stuff that the liberal establishment has really pushed back against so far, which are these invasive medical testing or even examinations. So I think there's two things that I want to emphasize here. One, yes, there are absolutely limits to the effectiveness of human rights legislation, but in the US, we don't even have that. So for example, instead, what we have is we have different parties that are arguing over whether or not the word gender, which is present in our human rights anti-discrimination legislation, if that word even extends to transgender people, right, or gender identity. So while we may have policy in place, that interpretation of that policy has not necessarily been codified in our favor. The second point that I want to make is that betrayals by the liberal establishment are not new, but they take on greater urgency in a period of right-wing ascendancy, particularly when there's this hard right or fascist elements that are afoot. Any kind of cover or legitimacy that is being given to these forces will only increase their ability to grow. Now is not the time for centrist solutions. There can really be no middle way.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And history is so full of examples of liberal ruling class forces doing precisely this, and basically not actually engaging in a battle of ideas against around this question of gender segregation and gender identity in sports, and then their perception that somehow this is a difficult argument, and therefore just making a move which is going to only put wind in the sails of the right wing assault.
Right, absolutely. I mean, we saw this move too with like the response to the police backlash too, right? The liberal establishment really like backpedaling almost immediately, right? As they gain a stronghold in office, shifting back to reforms that we know are not going to work, returning to the law and order kind of rhetoric. It's almost as if there's this like acute and sudden amnesia as to what's happened in the last even 5 years.
And I think it's just another thing we could add is that this is one of those examples of where arguments about culture, right, and things that happen outside of official politics, like in the realm of sports, actually are really important. They have also political implications for how ordinary people make sense of the world, right? And so if we don't take on the argument in the realm of sports, then what's next, right? It's definitely an opening the right can use to move in against trans people on other fronts.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a reason why we're seeing, right? Yeah, culture does matter. That's like we're seeing the right attacks on the drag story hours as being emblematic, right, of and working in the same sort of working in the same current as the anti-trans legislation, right? They're all sort of part of the same push. but oftentimes it's the cultural battles that get amplified into the sort of broader discourse and broader experience that ordinary working class people have. Yeah, so absolutely.
Thanks. Let's turn to talk about so-called Canada. Skyler, what are we seeing here?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Canada was a few years ahead of the States on a lot of LGBT rights issues, and it seems like we might just be a few years behind of the States on this being rolled back. We haven't really seen the sort of legislative attacks on trans people in Canada that we've seen in the States, at least not at the provincial or federal level. Outside of perhaps Alberta, where Premier Danielle Smith has a lot of connections to the far right, there doesn't seem to be as much political appetite for this sort of thing yet. On the federal level, while the People's Party of Canada, a far-right party that split from the Conservative Party, is very openly anti-trans, and they received about 5% of the vote last election, they have so far failed to win any seats. So they haven't had any presence in Parliament yet. And in terms of the Conservative Party, they seem to be trying to walk a bit of a narrow path on this issue and try to say as little as possible. Their current leader, Pierre Poilievre, he won the leadership with a lot of support from the whole convoy figures, and he's trying to build sort of a right-wing populist coalition, though his challenge right now is that he wants to build the right-wing populist coalition that will both appeal to right-wing populists and try to peel back some of the support from the PPC, which may have in part cost them the last election, but also doesn't want to alienate mainstream voters with the sort of unpopular social conservatism that has negatively impacted the Conservative Party's chances in previous elections. So aside from a few figures in the Conservative Party who, at least rhetorically, occasionally will show support for the trans community and not really do much on that, they tend to be silent on the issue. Where we're seeing a lot of the organizing happening right now is on the school board level. And I think in general, what we're seeing in Canada is sort of an alignment of forces coming out of the convoy occupation of Ottawa last February with the more established anti-trans, anti-woke, sort of Christian nationalist forces and some of the groups that have been organizing against things like comprehensive sex ed, parents' rights, so-called parents' rights kind of groups. In terms of these more established forces, they are largely kind of the usual suspects who've been around social conservative movements for a long time. Anti-abortion groups, Campaign Life Coalition, groups like the groups that were opposing sex ed, the Ontario sex ed curriculum, that sort of thing. One particularly interesting example is a group called Action for Canada. They started out of British Columbia. They initially started out with the focus on anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim politics. And over the years, they have sort of morphed and changed their focus. And now they're focused primarily on school boards and on anti-trans politics and on opposition to sex ed or, any sort of pro 2S LGBTQIA inclusive policies in schools. I think another big aspect in Canada is the media coverage. We have a lot of media coverage in particular from the Post media chain of outlets, has been really heavily pushing anti-trans narratives. And Post media does control a large portion of Canada's media ecosystem, including many local papers, which may not have the sort of reputation as kind of right-wing tabloids or right conservative media outlets as the National Post itself does. But there have also been a lot of other media outlets, mainstream media outlets, who have done things like platforming trans exclusionary radical feminists and others in sort of a misguided both sides thing. And finally, we get back to the far right and the convoy occupation and the organizing that has come out of that. So when we talked about the convoy occupation, what this was basically a 3-week-long far-right occupation of areas of Ottawa around Parliament. They occupied a lot of residential areas. You know, Ottawa's not that big of a city, so they managed to spread out into a lot of residential areas. And the occupation was focused mainly on COVID conspiracism and on mask and vaccine mandates. But you had all the far right were there. You know, you had the People's Party of Canada, you had far right groups like Canada First, Diagolon, Veterans for Freedom, a lot of Quebec-based far right groups. There were a lot of hate symbols. People talked a lot about the swastika and Confederate flags, but those were kind of just the tip of the iceberg. There were a lot of sort of lesser known hate symbols like the red ensign flag, the Gadsden flag, thin blue line flags, etc. And throughout this time, residents of Ottawa were basically taken hostage. The state didn't really act because there's no level of government which actually cares about people who live in places like Centretown or Vanier. And if you want more information on the convoy, I would recommend checking out the Ottawa People's Commission. They have recently issued their final report. They have basically collated a lot of people's experiences of the occupation, and they did this in a way to counter some of the sort of gaslighting of Ottawa residents. We'll see the media narrative is that, no, it actually wasn't that bad, that sort of thing. But the People's Commission has done a lot of work and has created a lot of recommendations for actions. So when we discuss the convoy, I think two things that are important are, one, it didn't come out of nowhere. The far right was active in street movements in Canada around anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant politics throughout the 2010s. They kind of moved into resource extraction issues and did a United We Roll convoy to Ottawa in 2019. They've kind of rebranded as COVID conspiracies, but a lot of these organizers are the same people who were around from previous iterations, from the anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant sort of thing. And it was sort of a watershed moment for the far right in Canada. The other thing is, while we've seen the convoy, we've seen the sort of far right, sort of post-convoy pivot into focus on anti-trans and anti-LGBT politics, we can't say that they only started with that recently. During the convoy occupation, houses that were flying pride flags were targeted. I know there was cases of people who had pride flags having feces thrown at their houses. I've heard some stories about visibly trans or gender nonconforming people just being harassed and threatened on the street just as they went about their daily business. And there's also a really quite telling photo of Billboard Chris, an anti-trans activist, and a number of people who would go on to run for school board, waving their anti-trans billboards at the convoy and receiving a lot of support. And there was also, in the convoy, there was also something that was underreported, was the strong kind of Christian dominionist aspect to it. There were a lot of things like Jericho walks around Parliament being planned, people carrying crosses, that sort of thing. So what happened with this whole far-right movement is that after the convoy, they continued to, because that was a huge watershed, they managed to break into the mainstream, get a lot of people, the current leader of the Conservative Party was literally bringing them coffee and donuts in order to support them as they were terrorizing Ottawa residents. As they kind of tried to keep the momentum going, they continued to discuss, their masks, vaccines, those sort of issues. But those issues kind of started to run out of steam as early last year, governments started to kind of give up on public health. So as masks and vaccines became less relevant issues, they started kind of did a little grasping at straws and trying to find a new issue to mobilize their followers on. And they sort of settled on anti-trans and anti-LGBT issue. Now, a lot of it does seem to be just based on the timing imported from the States. Not to say that there wasn't anti-trans, anti-LGBT organizing going on in Canada before that, but I see in a lot of these convoy Facebook groups, Telegram channels, whatever, a lot of American content coming up, American language, similar language being shared in all these Canadian convoy groups. And that has been sort of their main focus for the last about 6 to 9 months or so. And they are in general, they're the ones who are behind a lot of the street level actions, the whole protests against drag story times, attempts to cause disturbances at school boards, that sort of thing. The far right also made a push at the school board level in municipal elections last fall. They tried to get a lot of far right people elected to school boards. Generally, they did fairly poorly. In Ottawa, all of the anti-trans candidates were shut out, with only one race being really close, and our one anti-LGBT incumbent in the Catholic board was defeated. In some other cities, you'd have a few people elected, but I don't think they actually managed to take over any school boards. So that sort of attack was kind of beaten back, fortunately. But they continue to organize around school boards. We've seen them do a lot of. We've seen, for example, Action for Canada, which I mentioned earlier, has caused a lot of disruptions at school boards in British Columbia. I believe they've been banned from presenting at some school boards because they just cause disruptions and they just spout hateful comments at school board meetings. See here. The school board stuff, there's been a lot of organizing around that. We've also had on the drag storytime front, they have really focused on the drag story times. And in particular, they seem to be really going after 2S LGBTQIA youth and children. That's why they're going after drag story times. They're going after school boards because they want to use the whole, like, please won't somebody think of the children argument to really raise the temperature and try to bring people out on their side. And, it also makes things much more dangerous because those arguments tend to, increase the risk of violence and that sort of thing. In terms of the drag story times in Canada, they have been organizing, they had been trying to do a lot of protests against drag story times for the past few months. Generally, it would not go well for them. Occasionally, they would be able to get drag story time events canceled just from the use of threats and that sort of thing. However, whenever the community has mobilized to defend a drag story time, the far right has consistently been outnumbered, has been, hindered from harassing attendees and prevented from shutting the event down. They often get outnumbered by ratios as high as 10-1, even in very conservative rural communities. The LGBT allies have tended to show up and defend the drag story times and really outnumber the transphobic bigots who are trying to shut them down. So that is positive. However, the tactics on the far right have kind of shifted in recent weeks. They are being less and less. They are content to just stand outside with their signs as they get outnumbered and blocked out by supporters. And now they've tried to be more aggressive, trying to get into the buildings, trying to actually shut the events down. And of course, they've continued with things like threats and that sort of thing to try to shut down events. Notably, there was one in Brockville before Christmas where somebody had tried to set a fire in the library to try to the night before to try to stop the event, and then called in a bomb threat. Someone called in a bomb threat during the event, but the event went on. So the people who are showing up to try to shut down drag story times and trying to promote, trying to cause disruptions at school boards have, similar to as Eric has mentioned, they're all the same people who we recognize from the far right, the anti-vaxxers, the anti-maskers, the convoy types who've been out doing their street level convoy, post-convoy protests for basically ever since last year. So it's very much almost the exact same people, almost to a person, who are showing up to vote.
Thanks to both of you for giving us this overview. I want to move and just share some of the analysis that Misha Falk offered in her excellent article that I referred to earlier about how he makes sense of the overall attack. And in that article, she argues that, I'm going to quote at length here, that these attacks are not simply about eliminating an unwanted other, but also about inscribing a particular set of gender relations as natural. This is why institutional transphobia can't be reduced to an expression of sadism, the idea that the cruelty is the point, or simply a way for Republicans to get more votes. Rather, it is a fascistic project of imposing a Christian nationalist patriarchal family order on society as a whole. It's a product of a section of the ruling class vying to extend the dominance of its sexual hegemony in our decaying capitalist society, asserting a desperate fantasy that all the suffering and uncertainty brought about by capitalist crisis, social division, and environmental collapse will go away if we simply return to more traditional categories of meaning. We can therefore understand our present situation, Misha Falk writes, as one of competing sexual hegemonies, a competition between the liberal tolerance view that moral panics can be repressed if selected LGBTQ ways of being are protected through formal legal equality and hate crime laws, and a reactionary sexual hegemony that seeks the criminalization or outright elimination of all modes of being that conflict with the norms of the white Christian cis heterosexual nuclear family. I'd like to add to this that there's a real danger, I think, that the appeal of reactionary gender and sexuality politics will grow when the living standards of middle class and working class people get much worse, especially if capitalist crisis gets administered by a Democrat in the White House and in Canada by a liberal federal government. It's easy to imagine the anger of some of the people losing their jobs or homes being channeled by Republicans in the US and by conservatives in the People's Party in Canada, those people who blame liberals for, in their words, they would say, wasting time on woke concerns while hardworking people are suffering, that kind of a line. And in Canada, we have the additional part of the picture that the NDP is now so closely associated with liberals that they're very unlikely, I think, to be able to channel much of the anti-status quo sentiment, anti-liberal party sentiment in a better direction. So I'm interested, Eric and Skyler, if you have any thoughts on this line of analysis that Misha Falk has offered us.
Misha is spot on. Maybe just a clarification from Skyler. I don't think that trans and queer people are a target of convenience. I think there's a reason why we've seen an escalation in violence against women. I think there's a reason why we've seen attacks on abortion rights, not just in the US, but elsewhere, also wins, importantly, in other places of the world. And there's a reason why we've seen attacks on trans and queer people. And I think Misha is getting to that. I want to actually just highlight one of the sentences that you read that really struck me. It's when they write, is a project of a section of the ruling class vying to extend the dominance of sexual hegemony in our decaying capitalist society, asserting a desperate fantasy that all of the suffering and uncertainty brought about by capitalist crisis, social division, and environmental collapse will go away and simply return to more traditional categories of meaning. So yeah, absolutely. And I think, David, to your point, I think that it has the real potential to get worse. So when Silicon Valley Bank failed here a few months ago, it was a bank that is a big sort of tech bank here in the United States. The MAGA Republicans and the right-wing pundits were absolutely falling over themselves to make the claim that the bank had failed because it had wasted investments on woke diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives and risky environmental projects. So I think that logic is certainly there. On the other hand, also to Misha's point, there is a section of the ruling class that do not see queer and trans people as a threat to this sexual hegemony at all. They believe that, as with same-sex marriage, trans people, so long as we allow our bodies to be conformed into, bent into their cisgender correlative, can be seamlessly incorporated into capitalism's productive and reproductive needs. The Human Rights Campaign, the organization I referred to earlier, has produced a letter in opposition to the anti-trans legislation, and that letter has been signed by over 300 corporations, many of them Fortune 500 corporations. So, I think importantly, I'm not saying let's look to the liberal wing of the wealthy class to defend us. Absolutely, that is not the solution, because ultimately what that does is limit the scope of our queer and trans liberation, right? It limits it to a politics of multicultural inclusion rather than one concerned with redistribution. I think that's some of what Misha's comments are getting at.
I would also concur with Misha. I think definitely in the long term, the sort of reactionary far-right fascists are trying to would like to essentially eradicate trans and non-binary people through violence and intimidation and through these legal strategies. I think in general, these reactionaries have a lot of very particular ideas about gender and sexuality that are very deeply seated, and which just the very existence of trans and non-binary people really throws a wrench into that whole worldview. I would say that in terms of the whole issue of the I guess you could say the liberal establishment being concerned with wasting time on woke concerns as living standards decline. I think in Canada, one thing I like to say is that in general, Justin Trudeau is often good at saying the right things, but not particularly good at doing the right things. So I think he's good. The government is good at, maybe rhetorically showing their support for LGBT communities, but and this is a pattern that we've seen on a lot of issues with this government as well, both things like environmental issues. They're good at rhetorically supporting LGBT communities, but not so much when it comes time to put their money where their mouth is. And we've seen this pattern on environmental issues. They talk a big game about the environment and then turn around and spend billions of dollars buying a pipeline. They talk a big game about truth and reconciliation, but they don't really follow through on that either. And it's interesting because people on the left criticize them for not doing the right thing, and people on the right criticize them for the times where they say the right thing, but then usually not follow up. I think that is a big concern. We already see this is sort of the coalition that Pierre Poilievre is trying to form for the next election in Canada. I saw a poll recently that showed that he is getting more and more union support lately as a result of trying to appeal to this right populist kind of agenda, while also the failures of the Liberal government and now I guess the Liberal NDP coalition to meaningfully improve people's living standards. I think that is, as you mentioned, that is a real danger going forward, that failure to address people's living standards will result in the far right and right-wing populists getting much stronger. And also regarding the sort of liberal view that formal legal protections can address this issue. I mean, while they often can help and are important, I think we also need to recognize that also hate crime laws and things like that can occasionally backfire. We've seen in Canada in recent years, people have been accused of anti-fascist or anti-police hate crimes.
Well, thank you. And this can, I think, move us. We've spent almost an hour talking about the attacks to talking about resistance and what our analysis of the attacks on trans people means for how we should actually fight back. So who would like to start us off in talking about strategy and tactics here, how we resist?
I can speak to some of that. So I think in the currently the most visible aspects of the attacks on trans people, at least by the far right, are the attacks on drag events and on other queer spaces, and their organizing around the school boards. What has been actually quite successful in Canada has been organizing groups of drag defenders to show up and defend the drag events. We've seen across Canada for the past few months, as I mentioned earlier, the communities have easily outnumbered and the far right. And we've actually seen, I think, the far right's morale has taken a hit. I can give you one good example in particular was in Peterborough in recent months. I believe it was in December, they had a drag story time, which was canceled due to threats. In January, they had a drag story time where you had groups that announced a protest and community groups organized to do a counter protest. And you had, I think it was probably 150, 200 counter protesters versus about 30 of the homophobic, transphobic bigots protesting. Then follow that up in February, you had a similar thing, except this time, because the far right was so demoralized, they could only get 15 people out for the protest. Even some of the people who organized the protest in January didn't even show up to the protest in February. And then they had another one in March, more recently, where you had dozens of people in support of the event, and only one neo-Nazi showed up to protest it. So I think by continuing to defend the drag story times and other queer spaces, I think we are really sending a message to the far right that this isn't the community that you want to be messing with. And we have seen the far right in some ways get very demobilized by taking massive losses week after week after week in every city across the country in Canada. I think the other important thing is school boards. We've seen it's important to keep an eye on school board elections. That's very important because there are a lot of far-right candidates who are running who would be unlikely to get elected to any higher office, but who, because there's less name recognition, that sort of thing, in no political parties in school board elections, they're able to get elected to school boards and cause a lot of problems for LGBT students there. And they're also using school boards meetings to mobilize. We've seen in Ottawa at the past few school board meetings, we have seen far-right anti-LGBT groups basically try to either disrupt those meetings or use those as a focal point of organizing. But again, we were able to effectively outnumber them and sort of blunt the effectiveness of their trying to use the school boards to attack LGBT youth.
Yeah, no, good stuff. I have also been most inspired by this drag story hour defense actions. The best ones that I've seen have been organized in collaboration with the drag performers themselves. So there's a high degree of coordination here. They're colorful, they're celebratory. These are artistic events that are like really aimed at creating a safe environment for queer families and their allies to attend the drag event, as well as the protest, which really in itself becomes an extension of the drag event in many ways. These events have been successful in places like Jackson Heights, in contrast to the story I told earlier in the podcast, right? But these events have been successful in places like Jackson Heights, where drag story defenders work with and take lessons from abortion clinic defense protesters, right? Things like learning tactics like using big colorful umbrellas to keep the antis away, right? Again, to borrow some language from the abortion clinic defenders. So this is, I think, what important about this description is that it's a protest environment where both liberals and radicals have a place, right? I think that it's absolutely, Skylar, to your point, it's absolutely important that the left shut down fascist and the hard right formations, like whenever they raise their ugly heads, right? We have to absolutely disrupt this. But I think doing so in collaboration with liberal forces whenever we can, not to wait for them, right? Not to wait for them to call, but to construct our events in such a way that we're drawing out as large numbers as possible. I think unions have also been an area where we're just beginning to see the beginnings of this fight back. So there's a definite link between the anti-trans legislation and the attack on educational academic freedom, right? The book banning that's going on, the Don't Say Gay law in Florida, the anti-woke legislation in Florida. And so in Florida, the United Faculty of Florida has been actually using its contract language, like the clauses in its contract language, to push back against the state laws. And so that stuff is sort of tied up in court right now. But court is not the only place, right? We sort of talked a little bit about the balance between street activity, right, mobilizing a sort of base of left-wing and progressive people, and allowing the liberal establishment to do its legal thing. So in February, this is really brilliant stuff. In February, students at 6 universities in Florida walked out in protest of the governor's demand that these schools and universities begin sharing information about their transgender students, right? Because his sort of rationale there was that we shouldn't be using public money to support people in their transition. Not that that's what's happening, but nevertheless. So these students at 6 different universities organized these walkouts, and importantly, they're organized by the Dream Defenders, who are an important abolitionist, socialist, Black feminist, internationalist project, and in collaboration with the United Faculty of Florida, as well as formations like the Florida College Democrats and Florida Equality, right? So there's really room for both radical and liberal formations in this coalition kind of work. And I think that looking at that, those coalitions that fight back, I think points us a way forward and just gives me a little bit of hope, right? A little bit of inspiration as to how we might defeat this anti-trans wave.
So I think Eric made some very good points about these drag defenses. At these drag defenses, we're there for 2 reasons. First, we're there to ensure the physical safety of the performers, of the attendees, etc. But we're also there to show a symbolic rejection of the far right and of fascism. When you see 30 people on one side and 300 people on the other, that sends a strong message that these sort of fascist politics aren't tolerated in our community. Also, and this is where we get into tactics and what's actually happening at these events. You often do have more liberal formations, liberal groups, and more radical groups working together. You'll often have, say, some people kind of on the front lines holding banners. For example, there was a very successful drag defense at the National Arts Center in Ottawa back in February, where you had, it was not only did we outnumber them basically 300 to 30, but we were also so successful with using banners and flags as shields that we heard people commenting on the way out or after the event, like, was there even a protest? We didn't even see the hateful bigots because we were so effective at physically blocking them out with banners and flags and things like that. And you often see a situation where it has both a sort of more militant people kind of on the front lines, and you have also working with some other people who, maybe more liberal, who are more inclined towards symbolic protest, who are still supporting the people on the front lines by taking up space, even like having fun, having a sound system, stuff like that, enables, this sort of dynamic where you have people basically going to where they're needed, supporting the drag defense. And I think one thing that we've seen over the past few years is that people often learn by doing. There have been a lot of counters to the far right in Ottawa over the past year and a half. some more successful than others, but people have really learned. And I think at these drag defenses, you have a lot of people who maybe are coming in from a more liberal perspective, or who have an idea of it as more a symbolic protest kind of thing, but they see the more radical elements who are on the front lines, who are holding banners, who are physically preventing fascists from harassing families and children, and they are learning by example. And I think that's what has made the drag defenses so successful, at least in Canada, is having that sort of unity in action. And I think people are coming away with the drag defenses feeling empowered and feeling like they have a new appreciation for the politics of this struggle.
I think that's really a great way of putting it. It's very helpful to kind of give us that ground level perspective. And I think it just demonstrates, as you've said, but the importance of that willingness to have joint work, and that nothing there in any way means that people committed to trans liberation have to water down our politics, right? That somebody who shows up just thinking in terms of equality and protecting people's charter rights in Canada and so on can, be there alongside someone with an anti-capitalist vision of trans liberation, and political relationships can begin to be built in the discussions that happen in these events, and drawing more people into involvement for building for the next action and so on. And given how demobilized we've generally been during the pandemic, I think every one of these, little initiatives, all the self-activity is really valuable and important to nourish.
Yeah. Yes, I would definitely concur. That's what we've been seeing in terms of some of our big successes lately.
Any thoughts about the question of, you alluded to this a little bit before, but maybe drawing it out a little bit more in terms of who to rely on and who not to rely on, in terms of how we try to fight the right-wing attacks? Just because I think it's implicit in what we've been saying, but I think it's probably worth making a little more explicit.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just sort of thinking about how to organize my thoughts on this one. I mean, yeah, I feel like we've touched on this a bit already. Like, it's clear that we cannot rely on liberal politicians. It's clear that we can't rely on the segment of the capitalist class that is more friendly to queer and trans people or any kind of minoritized people. I do believe that human rights legislation is important, although I do not think that it is the be-all, end-all, right? I think that if we are not able to build robust movements that and David, you alluded to this in one of your questions earlier, that don't only see defending trans people as a moral issue, like we're doing this because we are conscious people and it's the right thing to do, but can understand and drill down and see why it is that gender oppression and trans oppression as related to that is central to the way in which capital extracts value from working class people. I think that centering that understanding is what will put trans liberation politics at the heart of our labor struggles, at the heart of our socialist struggles, at the heart of our abolitionist struggles, right? It's only through that connective work that we will be in a position not just to beat back the backlash, but to win over the long term.
Right. So I think it's that idea that this is obviously an ethical necessity, but there's an enormous strategic importance given what we've said about the forces that are behind this attack, right? And we need to be able to, for people who are maybe opposed to the right but have not yet got to the point, kind of recognizing the importance of the struggle around trans rights, we need to really push that, which doesn't mean in any way not talking about the substance of trans liberation, but that dimension, I think.
I think that is a really good point, right? Because it's a balancing act. At the same time, we don't want to broad stroke everything where we're not paying attention to the particularities of trans oppression or a trans experience in the world, a trans standpoint epistemology, if you will. But at the same time, I do think that it's important to situate this in the neoliberal decline. It's important to situate it in the disinvestment in public infrastructure, right? I was saying before, there's a reason why there's a gendered attack, and it's because this social welfare net, there is no social welfare net. It's women, it's queer people, it's working class people. Like we are required to perform social reproductive labor at a level that is absolutely exhausting and unsustainable. And so how does the state or right-wing elements of the state sort of coerce us into doing this? It's through gender discipline, right? And there are different forms of gender discipline, and this is just one really acute form of it. So absolutely.
Yeah, I would also say maybe take this back to the old slogan, "We keep us safe." I think who we definitely cannot rely on to keep us safe are the state and the police. We obviously have plenty of experiences with that in Ottawa with the convoy occupation. We've also seen, for example, at the successful drag defense that we had at the National Arts Center, when the anti-trans, when the anti-LGBT folks who showed up early, and we didn't quite have the numbers yet. It was a little touch and go, but what the police wanted to do was they wanted to separate us in such a way that you would have drag defenders on one side and the anti-LGBT fascists on the other side, and force the families who are attending the story time to run a gauntlet in between the two, so that the police would essentially enable the anti-LGBT groups to scream profanities and harassment and abuse at families and small children. Fortunately, we were able to hold our ground long enough that numbers started showing up and people started arriving with more banners and flags, and we were able to draw the line in such a way that that wasn't possible. We had a strong banner line, and we had the pathway to the entrance to the building be behind our lines. So the state and the police aren't the ones who are going to be able to keep us safe. They have totally failed during the convoy occupation of Ottawa, and they continue to often, they often side with the far right in these sorts of things. That's also important because we're seeing one of the responses to this be the creation of bubble zones in Calgary and in Ontario, being proposed in Ontario, similar to abortion clinic bubble zones. But we still need to continue mobilizing to keep our communities safe, even in spite of that. Oh yes, and in terms of liberal politicians, I think sometimes more liberal politicians often do show up, and they do show up to support drag defenses, but often in a more symbolic way, rather than being there on the front lines with the banners. And we maybe accept their support, but we're also making sure that we kind of keep our eyes on the ball.
If I could just share a few anecdotes in reaction, and then I'll probably have to wrap up shortly. But I wanted to share, that I really echo your caution about the police. The right-wing protests in Akron, Ohio, which saw hundreds of Proud Boys members and white supremacists. The outcome of that was that the organizer of the very modest pro drag queen side was the individual that ended up in handcuffs that day, right? Not the folks who are screaming, right? Pedophiles get the rope. The other thing that I want to center is the fact that queer and trans people have experienced histories of bias and abuse, right? Discrimination by law enforcement. I was reading a statistic from the Trans Equality Project. I believe I can double check that for you. 47% of Black transgender people report being incarcerated at some point in their lives. Right. So I think it's those sort of statistics that we also want to center, like when we're thinking about or when we're arguing about whether or not the police are a viable solution, perhaps to folks who have not yet drawn those conclusions for themselves.
I would also add to that, another very good example of this sort of thing is the Hamilton Pride defense in 2019, where a lot of pride defenders were assaulted by fascists, and a lot of them ended up facing repression from the police as a consequence for their successful pride defense.
For sure.
All right. Well, thanks. We've covered a lot of ground. Any last thoughts you'd like to offer before we wrap up?
I would say that, we're entering into what is a very scary time for trans and LGBT people. And I would just emphasize the importance of showing up, of understanding the issues. I think a lot of the time we're seeing the far right is using a lot of wedge issues, such as, women's sports, or trying to use issues around children, that sort of thing. And by being able to speak out against the issues when it's kind of the thin edge of the wedge, we can hopefully blunt this attack on trans and LGBT populations. And I think it's important for everyone to understand the issues and to, to counter anti-trans narratives in conversation, in the media, online, that sort of thing, and also to show up on the ground when you're needed.
Yeah, I guess I'd just close by, saying thank you. I've enjoyed being in conversation with you, Skyler and David. I think I want to end positive, right? I want to end with a little bit of hope. I always have to hold a little bit of place for hope. And one thing that I'm hopeful about is that our left and socialist spaces are taking more seriously the task of understanding queer and trans oppression, and centering it in a way that is not a question of moralism, right? But truly trying to understand the way in which that fits into a political, economic framework. So I'm feeling inspired by that.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.